Elmwood Cemetery was founded in 1852 on 40 acres. It's about 2.5 miles southeast of downtown Memphis. Now, it quickly expanded in size because of the interest to another 40 acres. Now, the bridge that we just crossed over, it's behind me right now, is the Morgan Bridge. It was built in 1903, and it is the longest unsupported arch bridge in the county. Now behind me is the Victorian Cottage. It is the superintendent's office. It was built in 1866 and it's had a couple expansions since then in 1903 and then again in 1998. But all three places, Elmwood Cemetery, this cottage, and the Morgan Bridge, are all on the National Register of Historic Places. Alright, the last building I wanted to point out is the Lord's Chapel behind me. It was dedicated in 2005. It sits 60 people. It has 3-sided windows, vaulted ceilings. It's supposed to have the same feel as the cottage, that Victorian era. It's not open because of COVID. Okay, so I've downloaded the audio file. It takes about an hour to drive all the way through. Let's go. So the first thing that you really learn on the audio tour is about the Yellow Fever Epidemic. So picture it, it's the 1800s. The city of Memphis is a stop along the Mississippi River, so there's lots of travelers that are passing through. There's hot climate, there's unsanitary conditions, it's less than ideal waste disposal. All of that is a breeding ground for the yellow fever. Now this spot behind me is known as No Man's Land. 8,500 Memphians died because of yellow fever. 2,500 of them are buried right here in Elmwood, and 1,500 is in the unmarked grave behind me. At the peak, they were doing 50 burials a day. A horse-drawn carriage would bring the bodies up, they would stack them until graves could be dug. Now this had a huge impact on the city. 1, it went bankrupt. 2, it lost its charter. And 3, if you had money, you just completely got out of town. Now there were a lot of heroes during the yellow fever epidemic, but the most interesting story is a lady named Annie Cook. She ran a quote-unquote resort for commercial affection. She ran a brothel, and it was off of Gayoso Street. Now during the 1878 yellow fever epidemic, she turned the mansion into a hospital, and her girls stayed around to care for those in need. Now she died in September of 1878, but the hooker hero became known as the Mary Madelene of Memphis. Alright, so this is a crazy story. Behind me is a monument to the victims of the Tennessee Children's Home Society. It was an adoption agency that basically ran as a black market for the purchase of children. Georgia Tann was the head of the organization, and if she found you unfit, whether it was because you were poor or unwed, she would take your child away from you and have them adopted at a really high fee. Children died in her care because they were left unattended and malnourished. 19 children are buried here at Elmwood, and this monument was erected in 2016 in their honor. Behind me are 2 of the oldest gravestones here in Elmwood. One is from 1832 and the other one is from 1841. You can barely make it out, but it's the Mosby family. Now, Elmwood Cemetery was founded in 1852, but as you drive around, you'll notice that some of the tombstones are older than that. And that's because there were 2 other prominent cemeteries in downtown Memphis. One was the Mara Cemetery, which is in today's South Main District. But as the city was expanding in 1859, it was decided that it was a nuisance to have a cemetery so close to the downtown. So all the caskets were moved out here to Elmwood. The second one was the Winchester Cemetery, and it was located near today's St. Jude, and by 1874 it was basically abandoned. It was in disrepair. Same thing, all the caskets moved here to Elmwood. Now the next section that I want to talk about in Elmwood is known as Confederates Rest. There's over 1,000 Confederate soldiers who are buried here in Elmwood. At the Victorian Cottage, when you first come in, you can get a list of the names. Now behind me is a monument that was erected in 1878 for the fallen soldiers, and over the years they've actually added grave markers for many of the soldiers here. Union soldiers were also buried here at Elmwood Cemetery. Now Tennessee succeeded from the Union in June of 1861, but a lot of Tennesseans were pro-Union. Between 35 and 50,000 Tennesseans volunteered for the Union Army, and 20,000 former slaves joined as well. Tennessee claimed more Union casualties than any other state. Interesting. 759 Union soldiers were moved from Elmwood to the National Cemetery when it opened. Unfortunately, when they did, they removed the caskets and in chalk wrote the soldiers' names. It rained that night, washing away all of the names of those Union soldiers. Next is Wade Hampton Bolton. He's the guy on the monument. If you look really closely, you'll see an unbuttoned vest and an untied shoe. That's how he wanted to be depicted. Now, Bolton died after he got into a feud with his business partner, Thomas Dickens, over a slave trade and money issues. He was shot in Court Square in 1869. Bolton's will was legendary. One of the things he did was give $5,000 to family members with the understanding that they would keep the feud with Dickens going. He also donated land to become an agricultural school, which eventually became Bolton High School, which is where I graduated. The tallest, most expensive monument here at Elmwood is right behind me. It's 65 feet tall. It is made of pink marble, and it belongs to the Reverend Albert Herman Thomas. Now, it was erected in the 1920s. It took 200 men to set it in place, and the estimated cost, $500,000. In the 1880s and 90s, there was a large influx of Chinese immigrants into the Mid-South. They were here to build railroads and levees, but many of them stayed around and became merchants. They sent for family members that were in China, and they used educational opportunities to move into different professions. I was really surprised by just the number of rows of Chinese Americans that are buried here at Elmwood. Robert R. Church Sr. was born into slavery in 1839 and became the first African-American millionaire in the Mid-South before his death in 1912. Throughout his life, he owned a restaurant, a saloon, hotel, and multiple real estate investments. After the Yellow Fever Epidemic, he was the first person to buy a $1,000 bond to help the city of Memphis regain its charter. In 1899, he built a 2,000-seat auditorium and park right off of Bill Street because at the time, African Americans could not use public parks. It hosted speakers like Booker T. Washington and President Roosevelt. It was also the largest auditorium that was owned by an African American in the entire world. Edward Hurl Crump was a businessman and a political boss. He was first elected to mayor of Memphis in 1909 and served 3 two-year terms. But he found out he could be more powerful behind the scenes, and by the early 1920s he was the most powerful man in state politics. Now, the way that he won elections was to get people to the polls. So his friends at the Memphis Police Department and the Fire Department, they would be taken off duty, and then they would chauffeur people to the polls to make sure that they voted. He also had a rule that you could not honk your horn in the city limits. He died in 1954, and he's buried behind me next to his wife, Bessie. Many of the Union soldiers were headed north on the Mississippi River when the Boyer... Now there's a couple, one, the 1994. Now she ran a quote-unquote